So, in terms of psychology's history and approaches, what we've been talking about is how psychology transitioned from a philosophy into a science. And so, we're going to pick up with that. We're going to be focusing especially on the early days of psych as a science. In our last presentation, we spent a little bit of time delving into philosophical roots. And we saw that there have been people who've been asking questions about the way that we think and the way that we behave for a really long time. But it's actually only recently that people began to try to find answers to those questions in a scientific way. So one of the biggest milestones in the evolution of psychology as a science came in the late 1800s in Leipzig, Germany, when Wilhelm Wundt actually conducted the first ever psychological experiment. And what this means is that for the first time, Wundt had a question about the mind and about like human thought on the way that we process things. And as opposed to just trying to come up with his own answer on his own without any sort of experimentation, he decided instead to rely on data and to rely on trials and different experiments to try to answer that question. The actual experiment, honestly, was sort of boring. What Wundt was trying to compare is sort of the difference between when something occurs and when we're aware that something has occurred. And so you can see in this image on the slide, sort of the apparatus that Wundt set up. That's Wundt actually sitting there in the chair with all of his colleagues looking at him. And what they would do is in the experiment, they would drop an object and they record when that object, hit the table or hit the floor. They also had a device where people would be able to record when they were aware that the object had dropped. So you now have two data sets that you can compare, which are when something actually happened and when you're aware something has happened. And so in this way, Wundt is starting to explore consciousness. He's really starting to explore awareness and how our awareness matches up to reality. Building off of Wundt's first psychological lab, he started to spend some time trying to explore how the mind is actually structured. And I want to be clear here because this is an area of confusion for a lot of introductory psych students. Wundt was not studying the brain. The brain is the physical organ that exists within your skull. Wundt wasn't interested in your brain. He didn't dissect people. What Wundt was interested in is the mind, which is more of a concept or an idea. And so he really wanted to know what components, and we're talking conceptual components, make up our thoughts. Wundt was trying to isolate what he called the atoms of the mind or the atoms of experience. He brought hundreds of people into his lab and he asked them to record their thoughts for him and to look at a variety of objects like apples and desks and animals and just tell him what they were thinking. His ultimate goal was to compare all of these observations and see if there was some commonality, if there was some way to take what people were thinking and break it down maybe into its most essential components. This actually led into sort of the first psychological approach, which is known as structuralism. Wundt's ideas laid the groundwork for this, but Edward Tishner is the one who's actually credited with coming up with structuralism. And structuralism is defined as an early school of thought that really attempted to show the structure of the human mind. Just like I explained with Wundt, structuralism's goal was to take thought, this like really complicated thing, and break it down into its simplest components. Um, Structuralists were inspired by the work of physical scientists at the time. When you think of what like chemistry is trying to do for the world, it's trying to take something that's really complicated, like the universe is a complicated place, right? The physical universe, and it's trying to break that down into its smallest and most basic components. And so you go from, all of matter, and you can break that down into elements and into atoms. And when you put those elements and those atoms together, you get different forms and different things. That's what Wundt and Tishner and all of structuralism, that's what they were trying to do for thought. The way that they attempted to do this is they used a research method, not the most scientific, but a research method called introspection. Introspection is defined as looking inward and reporting one's thoughts. So it's really just a fancy word for thinking about what you're thinking about and sharing that with other people. And so that's what Wundt and Tishner and structuralists ask people to do, as I described earlier. Structuralism was not the only first attempt to explore the way that we think. There also was something called functionalism, which also looked at thinking and looked at thought processes, but in a little bit of a different way. Functionalism was founded by psychologist William James. And what functionalism is all about is it sort of takes the whole focus of structuralism, which is breaking things apart, and throws it out the window. And functionalism says thought exists as this whole entity. Thought serves a purpose. And if you ignore that purpose, if you instead try to focus on like the smallest components of a thought, you're actually destroying what thought is. And so functionalism instead wanted to look at what is that purpose that each thought serves? How have our thinking processes evolved to allow us to adapt and to survive and to flourish? Functionalism saw thinking or saw your thoughts as an unbroken and unbreakable stream of consciousness. Whereas structuralist says, let's break this apart. Functionalist says you cannot do that. If you do that, you destroy what thought is. Let's instead look at thought as this whole entity and try to figure out what its point is. Now, William James is also known for a couple of other things. For one, he wrote one of the first widely adopted textbooks about psychology. It's called The Principles of Psychology. And if you can think about the early days of any discipline, the way that a discipline grows is each new generation is able to build on what past researchers have done, right? And so in order for psychology to grow, there needed to be a way for someone who's brand new to the field to sort of catch up and find out, well, what's already been done? What have people already been thinking about? How can I add to this? James's textbook gave new psychologists that entry point. He compiled all the stuff that had been going on into one place so that people had a place to start. And so this is one of the things we credit James with, yes, starting functionalism, but also with writing really the first psych textbook that was widely adopted. A couple other big names in the early years of psychology when people are first starting to ask questions about how we think and then answer them in a scientific way. Mary Calkins was actually the first woman president of the American Psychological Association, or the APA. She technically earned a PhD, but the school refused to grant it to her because she was a woman. It wasn't until Margaret Floyd Washburn, who actually earned the first PhD or was granted the first PhD as a woman. So Calkins did all the work. They just wouldn't hand over the degree. It wasn't until Washburn came around that they actually granted her